Jason, and good afternoon, everybody. And I'd like to thank everybody for joining us for archiving Olive View, 100 Years of Public Health in Los Angeles. Our academic and public programs are one of the ways our libraries create and sustain a sense of community, particularly while we live so much of our professional and personal lives in virtual spaces, just like this. As a research library connected to the intellectual life of Southern California, far beyond our campus, we have a distinct opportunity, and I believe a responsibility, to support academic experiences and help inform discussions of our shared vital history in the public sphere. When we began considering the possibility of acquiring the archive of the Olive View Tuberculosis Sanitarium, we didn't foresee just how vital its history would be in our current moment. Public health is acutely relevant now. It's at the forefront of the public imagination. And it's gratifying that the USC Libraries, through the collection and events like this, are able to support new discoveries and inspire new avenues of inquiry. Just about a year ago, we and our partners at the Huntington began working with colleagues at Olive View to move the physical collection. And Bill Deverell's got some great pictures of that enterprise. A couple of years before that, we launched a program called the USC Libraries Collections Convergence Initiative. It's quite a mouthful. The purpose of the initiative is to place library curators in close working relationships with disciplinary faculty who work directly with the libraries to focus and grow our primary source collections. I'm delighted that this collection came to our libraries through the initiative, and I'm grateful to everyone at USC Libraries, the Huntington, and Olive View for their commitment to these remarkable documents of Southern California history. Among those many people who helped us arrive at this celebration today are Dr. Selma from Olive View, Taran Haidostian and Elizabeth Logan of the Huntington-USC Institute on California and the West, our very own Tyson Gaskell, Patty Johnson, and Susie Noruschat of the USC Libraries, and Bill Deverell. I'm sure many of you know Bill as one of the preeminent historians of California. He's also a USC professor of history, director of the Huntington-USC Institute, and director of the library's Collections Convergence Initiative. And of all the years that I've known Bill, going on for a dozen now, he has never said no to anything that I've ever asked him to partner with me on. He's a thoughtful colleague and collaborator, and he's a dedicated champion of our libraries and the essential collections in our care. Thank you very, very much, Bill, for your work leading the initiative and supporting our libraries at USC. Thank you all for being part of our community today, and please join me in welcoming Bill Deverell to continue our program.
Thank you so much, Dean Quinlan. That's a remarkably generous introduction. It is a pleasure, all this work. I don't know that I'll ever say no to being asked to do interesting things with interesting colleagues. So I'm thrilled everyone's here. Today is a day that many of us have looked forward to celebrate the arrival of this remarkable archive into preservation and care in the USC Libraries. Today has been made possible by all those folks that Dean Quinlan mentioned, as well as many others. It's really been a village effort to draw this archive out of its in situ holdings on the campus of Olive View and bring it into the library. I won't belabor the long list, but many of you are actually on the call. Olive View administrators, Olive View staff, Alan Jutzi, the former chief curator of the Huntington, who introduced me to the whereabouts of the Olive View archive many years ago. The board of supervisors, particularly Supervisor Barger and Solis, who helped aid in the transfer of the materials, and their staffs. The Pasadena Respiratory Health Foundation, which generously helped underwrite the archival access and cataloging of the collection. My library colleagues, both at the Huntington and at USC, who are just wonderful to work with. My colleagues with the Institute on California in the West. And Dr. Selma Comes. None of this happens without Selma. And you'll hear from Selma in a few minutes discussing her own career at Olive View and her own superintendency and care of the archive and helping us make sure that it could travel into our care. So it's just a wonderful day, and I agree entirely with Dean Quinlan that Olive View arose about a century ago, right in the midst of the previous global pandemic, and these materials and these images remain critically important for study. tragically all the more so in these days. So it's a happy celebration, but it's also a sobering one in the sense that these are important archives for us to all get our heads and arms and hearts around. So with that, I'm going to turn to my friend and colleague, Susie Noruschat, who is the Southern California Libraries, Southern California specialist within special collections at the library. Susie was instrumental both in helping us think about the arrival of the archive and then literally in hefting boxes into the truck and bringing it. So Susie has prepared for us a visual tour of some of the documents and images in the collection. So Susie, please take it away.
Great. Okay, can everybody hear me? Good. Oh,
Yes.
well, thank you everyone for joining us today. As Professor Deverell mentioned, I am the Southern California Studies Specialist in Special Collections at USC Libraries, and I am here to tell you a bit about the contents of the Olive View Archive and to show you some examples, a few highlights from the collection. I wish I could share with you more than what time and the limitations of an online gathering allow, but I hope that this brief overview of the collection offers some sense of the range and richness of materials that make up this archive, which we are so honored to have here at USC as part of our collections documenting the histories and cultures of Southern California. So I thought I would start with this image taken on the day last year, when we picked up the collection at the Olive View UCLA Medical Center in Selma and transported it to USC. This is the team that packed and moved the records from filing cabinets into archival boxes. And this is the building, a facilities building on the site of the medical center where the collection had been stored for several years. At the far right is Dr. Selma, former head of anesthesiology at the Olive View UCLA Medical Center, who will be speaking with us in a few moments and who has done much to ensure that this archive survived over the years and was preserved. The others in the picture are from the Huntington-USC Institute on California and the West and USC Libraries, as Professor Deverell mentioned, all of whom are here today and have played a role in organizing this event. Taryn Haydostian, Professor Bill Deverell, me, and Dr. Elizabeth Logan. Now, not long after the collection arrived at USC, we received generous support from the Pasadena Respiratory Health Foundation, and we were able to hire a wonderful archivist, Kimberly Berry, to work on processing the collection, which comprises about 70 boxes of material. Our plan was to have the collection ready and open for researchers in early fall, so around this time. But as we all know, the pandemic struck and the campus went into lockdown in March. So the physical work of processing unfortunately had to come to a halt, and we'll have to pick up on it again when it's safe to do so. For now, however, I can share with you a few photographs of material from the archive. And I do want to emphasize that this is in no way a comprehensive representation of the collection's contents, but rather a selective sampling, a broad overview that I'm sure leaves out a lot of historical treasures in the collection that have yet to be discovered. So the collection is quite rich in photographic and visual documentation. These photos, for instance, are among many images in the archive of Olive View in its early years. An image on the left when the site was being constructed around 1918, and at the right, a later image of Olive View that shows the cottage plan layout of the sanatorium and the surrounding hilly, dry landscape that made this location in what was then a remote area of San Fernando Valley ideal for tuberculosis patients who were believed to need a warm and dry climate to heal. We see some of the cottages where the patients lived with screened-in porches where they could get lots of fresh air and sunlight. Photos and postcards also show some of the architectural variety at Olive View. It's many Spanish Revival style buildings. And the fact that the site included not only facilities for housing and treating patients, but an array of buildings to support this community living in an isolated way, removed from family and outside contacts. The postcard at the right shows the chapel at Olive View. And other buildings on the grounds included schools, social halls, a library, a post office, and I recently saw one document that made reference to an outdoor Olive View bowl for viewing films. A few architectural drawings and site plans are also part of the archive, and these date not only from the earliest decades of Olive View, from the 1920s and 30s, but from subsequent decades when the hospital was transformed into a larger, very modern facility and changed its treatment focus to cardiac disease and mental health services. And what I'm showing you here is a rendering of the Olive View Medical Center completed in 1971. As I understand, it became Olive View UCLA Medical Center in 1992. Of course, photographic documentation in the archive also extends to images of the people who lived and worked at Olive View, the patients and staff. Here is one photo of patients receiving treatment or perhaps having blood drawn or their blood pressure taken. It's a little difficult to tell. And here is one of many albums featuring activities, events, and holiday celebrations at Olive View, images that offer insight into everyday life at the hospital at different points in time. Photos of medical and administrative staff include this wonderful group portrait for which I do not have an exact date, but clearly seems to be from the early history of the sanatorium, sometime in the 1920s. And an album devoted to the nursing staff at Olive View from 1920 to 1970. And these pages of the album show both candid shots and group portraits from the 1950s that very helpfully include captions identifying who is pictured in the images. Beyond visual materials, there is an array of textual documentation, records relating to the administration of Olive View. This inventory of 1928, for instance, lists in detail supplies purchased and used at the sanatorium for patient care and treatment. Administrative documents also include things like minutes from meetings in different administrative units and areas of the hospital, like you see on the left, and even ephemeral items like holiday cards at the right. One document that my colleague Tyson Gaskill located as we were recently searching through a couple of boxes for materials to photograph is this reproduction of a 1917 letter written by 4 property owners who had recently purchased land near the proposed site of Olive View to the chairman and board of supervisors of Los Angeles County. In this letter, they state their opposition to the building of the sanatorium on this site, saying that they would, quote, be obliged to pass through the grounds of the proposed sanitarium for consumptives to get upon our land, and that this would not only be extremely depressing, disagreeable, dangerous, and annoying, but would certainly depreciate the value of our property very materially if it did not make it wholly unsaleable, end quote. So an early instance of NIMBYism in LA County. Another interesting area of the archive is the publications, proceedings, and pamphlets, such as these I'm showing you here, on pulmonary and respiratory research and treatments. And these kinds of documents are quite plentiful in the collection. Along with quite a bit of research that was undertaken, that was done at Olive View itself. Now, Olive View was not only a treatment facility, but there was a substantial laboratory group that engaged in early drug studies on TB and other research areas. These typescripts are only a few of many papers and studies by all of you researchers in the laboratory group. And these I'm showing you here were written by Dr. Emily Abel, who was the head pathologist and director of laboratories and research at Olive View for 30 years, from 1929 to 1959. Finally, I want to show you and I want to share with you a few examples of the Olive View newsletter, which was called Olive View Point. And I think this is a really special resource in the collection, since these newsletters are chock full of interesting information about life, daily life at the sanatorium. This was a patient-published newsletter, and we have a full run from 1934 to 1974, so 40 years worth of issues. At the left, I'm showing you a relatively early issue from 1937, which describes, for instance, courses of study that were available to patients who were also students. And we learn from this article that most of the instruction was given on the ward at the bedside. The Olive View newsletters, I think, are also quite fascinating in terms of their design. These are issues from 1940, 1949, and 1957. And you can see that the imagery on the covers ranges from lighthearted to quite melancholy, like this heart-wrenching cover design of a child holding an hourglass with the specter of death looming behind. Glimpses into life at Olive View are also captured in patient correspondence, diaries, transcribed oral histories, poetry, and a few instances of artwork, like this painting of Olive View, presumably done by a patient, which you see here. So this again was just a brief sampling of some of the materials in the collection, and what this overview hopefully shows is that this is an incredibly rich archive that is quite multifaceted in the range of materials it includes. Here at USC Libraries, we look forward to seeing how researchers, potentially from a variety of disciplines and perspectives, engage with the collection and the scholarly and creative projects that emerge from it. So thank you, and I am happy to take questions at the end of the program.
Thank you so much, Susie. That's a really terrific overview of the kind of depth and excitement of the archive, as well as its poignancy. So really grateful for that you created that for us. I did want to remind everybody a little bit of the run of show. We're going to wrap things up at 1 o'clock. You have a treat, another treat now, where we're going to have a conversation with two experts. And then as we close today, closer to 1, I invite you to pose questions in the chat feature of your Zoom screen. And Dr. Logan from the Institute of California in the West will raise the questions to our group. So with that, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce these two experts who've joined us today. Dr. Emily Abel is Emerita Professor of Public Health and Medicine at UCLA. Dr. Abel is the acknowledged expert on the history of tuberculosis in Southern California, the author of several books on that topic. We've known one another for years, and I always look to her scholarship to guide the way in the broadest questions of TB in our region. Emily is going to be in discussion with Dr. Calmes, who is literally a prime mover of the archive, both physically and intellectually. And Selma's long career is interwoven with Olive View and its legacies. And so between the two of them, we have further insight into this disease and also the documentary and visual record of it as it's comprised inside the Olive View archive. So Emily, I'm going to turn to you first with thanks to you both, and just ask you to contextualize the history of tuberculosis in our region from, let's say, the latter 19th century up into the rise of Olive View around the time of the First World War.
Sure. Okay, thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm really happy to say I will no longer be the acknowledged expert on TB in LA, if I ever was, because these archives will really tell us a great deal that we need to know and that I had no access to. Although I did speak to Selma, and she knew of the archive, but really told me not to even think about gaining access to them. I just want to say a little bit about some of the photographs. You could see how far away, how distant Olive View is from the center of the city. And it was really distant at a time when there were no freeways, and the streetcar did not get out that far. And so it was very hard for families to come and visit. It was also very hard to get staff to agree to come. You mentioned fire earlier, and they did worry about fire from the very beginning, especially because the cottages were all made of wood. And so when I was doing research, I kept reading about people who were scared about fires and nobody did anything about it, which is a little familiar. Oh, and then I just want to say the patients' newspapers are an invaluable source. Social historians of medicine have increasingly been looking at or trying to get the patient's point of view, not just the doctors and the nurses. And so certainly any patient diaries, letters, and newsletters will be extraordinarily important. But I was asked to say a little bit about tuberculosis. And these days it must seem really odd to hear somebody say that LA once had very good weather, but it was supposed to be the primary place to go if you had lung problems. And the major lung problem in the 19th century was tuberculosis, or consumption as it was called, and it was the most fearsome disease of the period. Some people could enjoy remissions of years, possibly even decades, but permanent cure was impossible until the advent of antibiotics in 1946. So to go back, 1876, after the extension of the Southern Pacific Railroad from San Francisco to Los Angeles, publicists tried to vie for what they considered the invalid trade. They wanted people to come to get better health in LA and also obviously to build it up. The problem from the point of view of these LA boosters was not yet the weather, but rather the fact that many of the health seekers who came were poor single men whom they called tramps, not the middle and upper class people they called the right kind. Also, scientific discoveries really altered the sense of what of the whole disease. In 1882, Robert Koch discovered the tubercle bacillus, and then people gradually had to contend with the idea that tuberculosis was communicable, which is one reason why those homeowners were saying it would be really dangerous to go through the lawns. So after wooing health seekers, Los Angeles tried to exclude them, especially poor people. Authorities posted signs in train stations to warn that Los Angeles had no free care for people from other states. And charitable groups begged East Coast branches not to send people with tuberculosis. And also some of the first attempts to get better care for people with tuberculosis went down in defeat because of the fear that the wrong kind of people would come. But then in 1910, there was the election of California Governor Hiram Warren Johnson, who was a progressive Republican, and he spurred the adoption of welfare measures. And one of the first was, well, not one of the first, but one of the many significant ones was the establishment in 1915 of the Bureau of Tuberculosis and the State Board of Health. And the director was a very interesting woman named Edith Tate Thompson, and I hope you all find out much more about her than I was able to. She cared an enormous amount about public health, but she really believed that Mexicans do not belong in the United States, and the conjunction of those two, public health and racism, are still themes that continue today. So California decided not to establish a state sanatorium, which was one option, but rather to provide $3 a week subsidy to counties for every indigent patient who entered an approved facility. So Olive View began construction in 1918 and it opened in 1920. And then it expanded very rapidly in the 1920s. They added many more nurses. As you heard, they had a laboratory and they had a surgery unit. And by 1930, it had 917 patients. Well, this expansion occurred at the same time as the great influx of Mexicans into Los Angeles, which would not have been a problem had people like Edith Tate Thompson not been so powerful. But health officials were convinced that Mexican bodies were especially vulnerable to tuberculosis and that they were disease carriers. There was an outbreak of plague in 1924 that killed 30 people, most of whom were Mexicans, and that seemed to prove to public health officials that Mexicans were especially likely to spread disease. But more than any other disease, tuberculosis helped health officials portray Mexicans as an overwhelming problem, partly because it's a chronic disease and therefore people need care for a very long time. And the main charge was that Mexicans were a burden because they used excessive amounts of healthcare services and thus overwhelmed government budgets. There were two reports that came out from Edith Tate Thompson in the mid-1920s. One was a statistical study of sickness among the Mexicans in the Los Angeles County Hospital from 1922 to 1924. And the second was a summary of cases where tuberculosis is a problem. And the first consisted of a series of statistical tables showing the amount spent caring for Mexicans in the county hospital. The statistics in the second detailed the amount of county relief that was spent on Mexican families in which somebody had the disease. And Edith Tate Thompson wrote the introduction, and she noted that the 1924 Immigration Act had just been passed and it had established a quota system, but not for Mexicans. And so she led a campaign to extend the quota system. I should point out that Dr. Emily Abel, whom you heard about before, who was head of medical research for many years, and was also medical director of Olive View starting in 1934, he disputed the belief that Mexicans had a racial susceptibility to tuberculosis, but his findings, unfortunately, were widely disregarded. So we get up to the 1930s, which is the Depression, and the state subsidy continued, but county cutbacks affected Olive View quite a bit. Edith Tate Thompson was complained always about the lack of nurses and what she saw as really substandard care for quite a while. But as the Depression intensified, there was increased focus on Mexicans as disease burdens and disease carriers. And in 1930, there was a report by Governor Young it was a Mexican fact-finding committee, and they focused on the cost of treating Mexicans. And Edith Tate Thompson was especially irate about Mexicans in Olive View. She knew, as the archives show, that Olive View really provided very good care at that time, and it was especially remarkable when compared to the county hospital, which was severely overcrowded and actually was not a good place to go. And so she, in one of her reports, she detailed the example of one Mexican family which had 3 children in Olive View, and she wrote that $12,000 had been spent giving care to these, quote, subnormal Mexican children. So 2 measures reduced Mexican access to Olive View. One was a state law that restricted the state subsidy to citizens. And also at the same time, people like Tate Thompson tried to encourage Mexicans just to get home care and not to go into expensive institutions. And then finally, state and local health officials were major players in the deportation and repatriation drives, which reduced the size of the Mexican community in Los Angeles by 1/3. And I'm going to stop here, although I do have to say that, yes, public health has been greatly underfunded and is, and I hope this new disaster is teaching us all how important it is, but it also has a past that we have to contend with. So now I want to turn it over to Selma and ask you, Selma, could you tell us a little bit about your own history in Olive View and also why you decided that these archives were so important?
Thanks, Emily. It's really nice to be participating in this, and I'm just amazingly excited that the archives finally will have a home. I've worried about them for years, that they might be burnt up or destroyed by heat and dust. So we've made an important step, I think. I became chief of anesthesia at Olive View in 1988. I'd worked at the hospital for a part-time function over probably the previous 5 years. They were always short of staff, and I was at UCLA, and so I would fill in there. I came as chief of anesthesia, and this was part of the move to link Olive View with UCLA Medical School and to try to increase the quality of medical care that was taking place. And I want to just go back a little bit. Initially, Olive View was the TB sanitarium, and then TB began to be cured after the introduction of drugs in the late 1940s. And so then the question becomes, what is going to happen with this large facility that employs a lot of people, takes care of a lot of people with tuberculosis? And there was just a gigantic political fight with many competing groups about what Olive View should be. Should it be a general hospital? And the population of the San Fernando Valley at that point was concerned that this would be providing healthcare to undesirable people. So they didn't want it. They only wanted private medicine by private MDs. And so finally, after a lengthy political process, it was agreed that that a general hospital covering people with mental health as well as general disease would be built. And that hospital opened in 1971, a beautiful, very lovely facility. And soon after it opened in 1971, it was destroyed in the Selma earthquake. And so then the question is, are we going to pay a lot more money to redo this destroyed hospital? And also, who's going to be taken care of at this hospital? There was a lengthy, I believe it was 16-year political process before Olive View finally was started to be rebuilt. And I want to just mention that the nearby VA hospital was also destroyed in the Selma quake. It was a red brick building that cared for tuberculosis patients in the veteran population. And it was another victim of the earthquake. And then I'm sure you all remember that Olive View had extensive damage in the 1994 Northridge quake. So this is a hospital with such a dramatic history. It's really very much fun to talk about this to medical groups and all the drama and emergencies that have come. So anyway, in terms of my interest in the archives, when I first arrived at Olive View, one of the facilities workers, and these are the men that take care of the buildings and so on, do the maintenance, found out that I was interested in history and lassoed me into helping him. He had taken over one of the small cottages which had previously housed staff because the workers of Olive View lived at the facility. And there were all these cute little cottages and some dorms around the campus. And he had one of these cottages for the archival material. And as he cleaned out buildings and took care of them, he would take the documents that he knew were valuable and stash them away. And that's what he took me to see one day. And it was just an incredible, exciting time, because I felt like there was this treasure that was so hidden and it needed to be exposed. By this time, by the way, I had been able to take a National Endowment for the Humanities course in medical history. They were offering these for people in healthcare in the late 1970s. And that had gotten me started on historical research related to women physicians, first Elizabeth Blackwell, and then Dr. Virginia Apgar, the anesthesiologist, to develop the Apgar score. And I was really into telling the stories of these hidden women physicians. And I was pretty sure I was going to find some at Olive View. And indeed, I did eventually. It turned out that there was a woman physician's apartment building, and about half the doctors were female, usually single. And they had this little nest in a building with a rose garden. They would take shopping trips and so on. And this was a very unusual situation for women doctors of the time. There were very few of them. Most of them weren't married. They were paid less than men. And so Olive View's community was very much needed by these women. And another aspect of the women doctor situation is that the head of surgery, Dr. Jane Skillen, was female and married to Dr. Bogan, and they had some children. And when I first heard about Dr. Skillen, it was just amazing to me, because they had a house after Bogan and Skillen married. They were given a house on the campus. And they started to have children. I think they had 3 children, one of which, by the way, was an LA County employee, the head of public health in Long Beach for many, many years, a very respected practitioner. Dr. Ellen Alcon is her name. And anyway, Ellen Alcon was telling me that her mother would walk home at lunchtime, and a patient who had recovered from tuberculosis would cook the meal and also do the housekeeping. And also she was available for babysitting. And so she solved this situation at Olive View, solved the most important problem for women in medicine, and that's how do you take care of kids and also do things like have food on the table and so on. And I thought it was a wonderful solution, and it solved many problems for Dr. Skillen. She was a very good surgeon and worked for many, many years at Olive View. And Dr. Alcon, by the way, has written Dr. Skillen's history. And So you'll find that as the archivists work, and I hope that we can expand some more on that. The other thing that played a role in terms of my thinking about Olive View was the fact that it was a community. The workers lived there, the patients lived there. The patients couldn't do very much. Olive View was very isolated geographically. The 405 freeway wasn't built yet. Most people didn't have cars, and it was a long ways to Olive View. So the patients were like on their own, and they managed to do an incredible amount of useful things. For example, having a post office, a barber shop, a radio station, Olive View Point. And the Olive View Point is just incredibly great reading. And also it's very, very creative. There were many artistic people who painted the covers of the newsletter and so on. Unfortunately, many of those newsletters are deteriorating physically. So I'm really glad they are finally going to be guarded at USC. The final point I want to just make is that one of the reasons I think Olive View meant so much to me and to work to preserve its history is that when I was a child, I'd had polio here in Southern California and was in the hospital for a long time. And I didn't ever link that up, but as I walked around the campus and thought about all these patients who were bedridden for months and away from their family, that brought to mind the experience of being a polio patient. Again, isolated from your family, and it just kind of clicked for me. Although as I said, I didn't realize that for a long time, but it was driving behind my mind to tell the story of these people who are sick and yet are still able to maintain a community. Another small point about that is the workers. Most of the workers lived on the Olive View campus and little houses. Also things like raising hogs, raising chickens, having fruit trees, growing vegetables. That was very much a part of what the workers did. And these were workers typically who had recovered from TB, but who yet weren't strong enough to go out in the community and compete for a job, especially during the Depression years. So they, all came together to provide food for the patients and help the patients with what they needed as the patients started to recover. So Emily, I want to just mention one thing. You had said that you tried to use the Olive View archives when you were doing one of your books, and I know that you did use some county archives, and which ones were you able to find? Because I think there's some more out there.
Well, when I used the county archives, it was an incredibly sad story. I went to the county office and I asked if they had records, and somebody said, "Oh, this woman might know." And so I talked to her, and she would bring me out boxes, and I would give her back the boxes, and I would give her some, I would tell her what I wanted to get Xeroxed at the time. And at one point I said, "Are you an archivist?" And she said, "Well, what is an archivist?" And then I realized that there was no control over these absolutely invaluable papers. I would sit, she was not even in the room I was in. I was in a room where people came and went. And I was used to, you left an archive and you had to show everything, almost take your clothes off to show that you hadn't taken anything. I could walk out of there. Once I asked her to Xerox something and she gave me the original back and she said, oh, well, we have 2 copies of this, which, you know, is just terrible. So I am especially glad that that these papers are going to be preserved.
Well,
Absolutely. Go ahead, Selma, and then I think it's probably time for us to turn to our guest as well. But go ahead, Selma, if you have another thought.
Okay, I was just going to say, I am just delighted that they have a home, and it's a home where they'll be cared for. And I expect all kinds of great books and tales about what happened at Olive View. So
Yeah. I can't, I mean, I'm speaking for my friends and colleagues in the library in this as well, but I can't wait till we can welcome you both physically into the archive once it's processed, and you can both help us interpret even the greater sense of the richness of what's in there. And, you know, do honor to these patients. I think you both did a wonderful job just thinking about these people who were, after all, people who had just gotten sick. And it's just a fascinating way to peel back history and also be reminded of some of the current challenges we face. So thank you to the 3 of you for the presentation of some of the insights of this archive. And it's wonderful to be on that campus and speak to some of the maintenance folks the days we went out there, and have them note that we were working alongside Selma and have them say, oh, well, whatever Selma wants will help you. So thank you all. I think it's time to turn to Elizabeth Logan, who's going to help us with moderating the Q&A that we have about nearly 15 minutes for. So please let us hear from you in the chat if you have questions for any of our speakers about the archive.
Great, thanks, Bill. Before we launch into question and answer, just wanted to offer a couple of additional thank yous. The first to Professor Jessica Kim, who's a member of our Institute on California in the West family. She was there that day to help box up the archive, and the only reason she's not in the picture is because she was the one taking it and documenting our journey. So special thanks to her, and then also to our county partners. We want to welcome Jared DeGonia, who is here today on behalf of Supervisor Barger, and also served as a deputy for Supervisor Antonovich, and thank you to them for making this all happen as well. So let's turn to some questions. We have a whole bunch, so we'll try and get through as many as we can. First, Susie, a kind of bundling of questions to you. We understand it's very difficult in this time to predict timeframes, but there's some curiosity about your best guess on timeframes. Also, is it the plan for the collection to be digitized and put onto USC's digital library? And to the extent that is the plan, will that be a phased rollout of those resources, or do you anticipate that everything will be kind of fully cataloged and digitized before anything is available?
You know, I think realistically, it will probably be a few months maybe before it's, we're back up and running with, you know, fully processed collection. Hopefully we can get to it as quickly as possible, but we don't know the safety of getting back and getting in the space where our processing takes place. Just rest assured we're going to do our best to get back in as quickly as we can. Of course, that depends on, you know, the reopening of the libraries, reopening of campus. And, you know, we will make an announcement when the collection is ready and open for researchers. You know, as far as digitization goes, I think what we will probably do first is fully process the collection and then see about, you know, the feasibility of, you know, finding any funding to get the materials digitized, which will probably take a while. I think that there are, you know, some materials in that collection that are really ripe for digitization, like those Olive View Point newsletters, Other materials, you know, we really need to make a determination about, you know, whether it would be phased or try to digitize the whole thing. But that is really yet to be determined.
Great, thank you. So the next question is for probably either Emily or Selma. It refers to one of Susie's slides, one of the sketches from the cover of the newsletter, the one with the baby and the Grim Reaper. And the question is, how do babies fit into Olive View, and what do you know about kind of the youngest members of our community and TB?
Selma, do you want to answer that? You know, I don't know what the age was of people there. I know that it was very, very hard for the children because their parents couldn't get there. And also many families didn't have telephones, so they couldn't even hear how somebody was doing. And it was so far away, but I don't know how young people were when they came. Do you?
I
Selma?
don't exactly, but I can tell you in pictures, children at Olive View, and these were typically at Christmas time when Santa Claus was coming, they looked to me like they would be between 2 and 3 years old at the youngest, and most of them were older children, you know, 9, 10, and so on. Just for the general population, TB is easily communicable, and we always think of it as in the lungs, but it's also exhaled, and it can affect the larynx, the speaking voice box, the kidneys, the intestines. It's just a really vicious disease, and it must have been really terrible to be a child. A lot of efforts were made to, I want to say, entertain the children at Christmas time. Santa Claus movies were played. The Hollywood studios would, you know, bring moving pictures for the children. So there was a big effort to try to entertain them, but it was really tough. I forgot to say earlier that at least at the first part of Olive View, you had to lie completely still. You couldn't sing, laugh, all the things that are so much fun to do in life. And so to be a child and not be able to do that must have been really bad. So it was primarily an adult population, but there were some children, and we don't have numbers.
All those regulations about not singing, I mean, that was not unique to Olive View. Those were just,
Right.
that's the way it was. But one of the early letters that went to Edith Tate Thompson said, well, it's pretty good here, but the director really is a martinet, or he's really strict. And that was how patients felt about just about any sanatorium they were in.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. The next question is for Emily to help us try and figure out how Olive View fits into the larger landscape of tuberculosis. So Barlow Respiratory Hospital by Dodger Stadium, the guest writes, predates Olive View. So how does Barlow fit in with Olive View and the history of TB in Southern California?
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of private facilities for people with TB, but the importance of this was that it was a public hospital. And so you could go if you were poor. I mean, you know, so many facilities now that treat cancer patients were started originally as TB sanatoriums. So we think of City of Hope, which was originally a place for people with TB. But in any case, what was so important about Olive View was that it was free care. And that's why Edith Tate Thompson was so angry, because people she considered unworthy were getting some of this care.
Thank you. We have a question, Susie, about further collecting with regard to Olive View. So this collection came in one chunk. Are there any provisions for continuing to collect with regard to the space?
we do not have any plans or any collections that are sort of on the table. But this definitely seems to be an area that we've built over the years. We also have the Rancho Los Amigos hospital records, which came in many, many years ago, a different sort of care facility. But at this point, we do not have any definite plans, no.
Could I just make a quick comment? There are still a lot of patients from Olive View who are around, especially around the institution, and they are just full of information. For the 75th anniversary, we had a lunch for patients that we could find, and it was just the most glorious afternoon. The stories that they would tell, and also the interactions between them, the emotional links they had from being patients at Olive View. So there's still a lot that can be done, even though the records that are generated now are modern medical care. And they're all digital, by the way, just about. So, but there's still opportunity.
There's a very broad question.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, I certainly think some oral histories would be a wonderful
yes
to this collection. Yes, absolutely. Yep.
For our final question, a very kind of broad overarching question came in for Emily and Selma that has to do with the relationship as you see it between kind of public awareness of the existence of public health professionals and the overall health of the community. And I think the question is kind of pointing at our current moment and wondering if this is going to lead to kind of greater public health and awareness from that, or if this is something that's just going to kind of pass and fade into our memories.
Well, I certainly hope that this is not just a passing moment, because this is not the only pandemic, and we have had such a poor record on public health for so many years. And, you know, there's so much that has been exposed by this pandemic, including the dismal funding for public health. And it would really be a shame if we don't take this moment to try and make some really substantial reforms.
Agree.
Terrific. And just one question that I'm happy to answer. There's a question about, will this presentation be recorded and posted? And the answer is absolutely. And we can send the link through to your email that you use to RSVP. Bill, I'm going to hand it to you to close us out.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So we've reached the appointed hour. We hope you enjoyed this. We are certainly going to offer armfuls of gratitude to our speakers and guests and friends. And again, please remember that the successful arrival of this material was the committed effort of so many people to make this happen, Selma primary among them. But we hope you've enjoyed this. I want to offer again my thanks, our collective thanks, to Dean Catherine Quinlan from the USC Libraries, who certainly helps us make all this possible and who kicked things off so nicely. And just thank you, the three of you, so very much. And thank you all for joining us. I hope everyone has a good day, and please stay well and healthy.